let me just begin by congratulating Rich and Eduardo and Agustina for what I think is a seminal contribution. And I'm going to organize my comments both in terms of summarizing what I think are some of the big takeaways of this edited volume, but also adding to it a bit, because I think in some respects it's a little too modest, and it's not nearly as provocative as it might be. So let me begin by saying that SNR, subnational research, not to be confused with SNL, is a new. I think it's Rich has been writing about this. You've all been writing about this. Others have been writing about it, but this is the, I think, quintessential methodological statement of what SNR brings to the study of comparative politics. But it's also pushing us to embrace a whole new analytic agenda. And I'm all the more thrilled. I'm partisan in this debate, but I'm all the more thrilled because I think this is something distinctly Watsonish, that there's a long tradition here going back 30 years of comparative politics and comparative sociology, but this subnational take on comparative politics is born out of the Watson. It's born out of the graduate program in development and Rich's work and his collaboration with colleagues and students. And it's really exciting to see this intellectual community take the form of this seminal contribution. I think this is a state-of-the-art contribution, and I also think, and this is one of the provocations, it's a rallying cry. And it's basically a rallying cry for doing field work. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment. But let me begin with a provocation, since I'm the only, well, Margaret's sociologist as well, but I'm the only pure sociologist, for whatever that's worth. We're all guilty to some degree. But, some sociologists are going to read this volume, which is entirely political scientists, and say, well, duh. And anthropologists are going to say that as well, right, at some level. There's the Chicago school, which was a whole school of taking the local seriously. There's Du Bois and his seminal study of Philadelphia, which I still think is maybe one of the most extraordinary contributions to thinking about the subnational. There's the entire tradition of urban sociology, which is a very distinct tradition of looking at the subnational, city specifically. And then of late, there's been an explosion of literature on neighborhood effects. And now, we know beyond any measure of a doubt that space matters, right? Even when you control for everything else, income, race, all the usual variables, the place you are born in, the place that you go to school and that you evolve and socialize from has huge impacts on your future life course, right? So in that respect, this is a convergence across disciplines. But I recognize in political science in particular, this is, I think, a rupture statement. This is a huge corrective to what I think has been a massive, massive bias in the literature, the fetishization of the nation. Recently, Ulrich Beck, a sociologist, has said it's time to retire the nation state as what he calls a zombie category. And I think that's a huge, that's sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and it's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. But it's true that we have fetishized the nation state category for a long time. And this is true in comparative politics. It's also true in the sociology of development. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why did we fetishize the nation state so much, a kind of sociology of knowledge? And part of it is a data artifact. Right? Where's the data? It's at the national level. Yeah, and especially now that we all have computers and internet connections, it's easy and quick to get data at the national level. It's much harder to get data at the subnational level. Where's the power? Where's the influence as academics, as policy advisors? Again, it's at the nation state. That's where we want to interact for the most part, or at least historically that was true. I also think we've always assumed that the states as makers of nations are the central places in which discourses and identities are constructed, and that's certainly been true for a long time. I don't think it's as true as it used to be, and I'll give some examples in a moment. And then fourthly, there's a kind of parochialism. I mean, for those who want to study someplace that's not their own place, going to the capital city is the easiest way to do it, right? There's an airport, there's a Hilton, there's a Starbucks, et cetera. It's nice, it's comfortable. And I think it reflects this kind of aversion to doing, what I would call real field work, right? Getting out there into the field. I think what SNR is doing is removing some of these blinders in really powerful ways. So one way is how we think about economies, and Rick's work and others showing that industrial districts really matter and they're different from the national economies. But it's also about reminding us of something the old classical political economists knew, but we lost sight of, is that markets and production are not the same thing. When we study the nation, we study markets. When you go local into industrial districts and factories and cities, you study actual production. And there's a huge difference in how we then think about economies. I think moving from the nation to the subnational forces us to rethink just about everything we thought we understood about governance and stateness. When we think about governance in a national model, we're thinking of the traditional Weberian top-down vertical line departments, and surely those are really important. When you study the local, especially when you get down to the city level, you realize that the key to governance is not so much line departments, it's horizontal coordination. And that's why the planning literature is actually much more vibrant in the local context than we study it at the national level. It also makes us pay more attention to the frontline state. You study the national, it's these faraway bureaucrats issuing decrees and passing legislation, managing the macroeconomy, et cetera. But the real day-to-day work of the state is the frontline state. And again, once we take this to the subnational, we're more sensitive to the significance of the frontline state and Elinor Zostrom's ideas about co-production, et cetera. The development literature in sociology, as in poli-sci, was always dominated by national models. The developmental state was always about national growth and national industrialization. Sometimes they paid attention to redistribution, but in very traditional sort of political economy metrics. Once you get to the local level, you start to appreciate the Sennian perspective on capability enhancement, right? That the key to development isn't just growth or redistribution. It's like getting access to water. It's like having a proper transport system. Why is it in the development literature we've never studied sewers? Turns out access to sanitation is kind of a really important public good, and we sort of take it for granted in the national literature. The minute you go to the local level, it becomes a big issue, right? So it changes the perspective. And then, of course, I think the huge contribution of this volume is it forces us to rethink democracy itself. And again, the national level aligns with traditional aggregative theories of democracy. Democracy is individuals have interests, they organize, sometimes they overcome collective action problems, and then they vote. And you sort of count up the votes, and you've got yourself a government, right? And good data, right? Election data, et cetera, and you can fetishize all that. And in the process, we forget what democracy is really about, which is preference formation. It's not just how you count the preferences, it's how you form the preferences. And it's interesting to note that all the theorists of deliberative democracy studied local government. Aristotle and Cities, Ambedkar and Village India, Mansbridge and her studies of New England town halls, Carol Pateman, more recently Arkon Fung and Eric Wright, all studies of the local that emphasize the deliberative dimensions of democracy. I thought about bringing some maps and then realized this was more of a conversation, but if you're doing subnational, you can do maps. I'm interested in maps because they reveal something very distinct in recent development. So we're all in a state of, quasi-panic with the rise of ethno-nationalism in the US, Brazil, India, many other places. And what's so striking about the electoral patterns that have brought these charismatic national populist leaders to power is that it is completely subnationalized. Right? So the map in the US is very clear, urban, rural, right? It's almost all people close to cold water. Think about it. All the blue districts are close to cold water. 1 minute? Okay. BJP in India, it's strictly regional phenomenon. no penetration in the South whatsoever, but all the global cities of India, Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai, voted for Modi. Brazil, same regional north-south distinction, and again, all the global cities voted for Bolsonaro. So there's a whole democratic dynamic there taking place that we barely understand. And then finally, I have 1 minute left. The volume does my favorite thing in the world. It brings civil society back in. And, this is, if political scientists get to study the state, and if anthropologists get to study community, and economists the market, all we've got left as sociologists is civil society. And it's great to see a volume by political scientists bringing civil society back in, back to Ashutosh Varshney's book on studying communalism in India and pairing cities and finding that it's the density of civil society, to one of the contributions in the book from Kale and Mazaberi that shows that it's really the density of CSOs in India that shapes the distribution of public goods. So it's nice to see civil society come back in through the lens of subnational comparative research. So thank you all.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate the authors on a really outstanding volume. I was so inspired by it that I prepared about 50 minutes worth of comments, but I'll try to rein myself in here. So if I jump around, that's why. I want to say, first of all, that I found the introduction to this volume a tour de force, and I think it should be required reading for students, not only in comparative politics, but also in American politics and IR. It is a really trenchant and sweeping parsing of the literature, so you can really make sense of a huge swath of literature, and they've really done a remarkable job at making sense of that literature. And I want to disagree with Patrick a little bit, because I think it offers something even to sociologists, in the sense that I know that literature on neighborhood effects upside down and backwards, and what it doesn't do is situate place within a broader structure. It's like, this is what is happening in the neighborhood. And I think what your book does is to have us pay attention to the ways that places are interconnected and the relationships among them. I think that's very, very valuable way to look at politics and society. So what I want to do in my remarks, which will be within the allotted time, is to raise a few issues that I think are the contributions, and then link them especially to American politics, how I think they relate to American politics. So one of the main points that is made is that subnational variation can make theoretical contributions by providing a perspective on how nation states should be characterized with regard to key issues like, is the United States a democracy? What is the level of social protection? When these things are presented only at the national level, their argument is you're missing part of the story if you don't understand what some of the subnational variation is. And from someone coming from the U.S., this is, of course, a really important idea. I particularly like the idea that I guess Agustina and an author have proposed of creating a Gini index to look at, just to be able to rate how democratic is the United States, how much social protection is there by incorporating some of that subnational variation in there. So there has been some attention to this issue in the U.S., this issue about the uneven reach and capacity of state institutions to affect the provision of public services. Suzanne Mettler has a book, Dividing Citizens, which does an excellent job of showing how New Deal social policies that the states assumed responsibility for were much less comprehensive, led to a second-class citizenship, and that particularly affected African Americans and women. There's been a large literature dealing with state variation in spending and regulations, but I think increasingly we need to look at the local level in the United States. So people have talked about non-state provision of social benefits. And I think once you look at non-state provision, which is pervasive in the United States, you also want to look at the metropolitan area level. And I've done that in some of my research, comparing northern cities, which have what I call a public civic way, ecology of organizations for delivering services, and in the South, a very different ecology, which I call a religious private, that stems from very different histories of immigration. And I actually think that the spatial and place orientation combined with over time analyses, those two things I think work together very well, because places often have very different kinds of developmental trajectories, and making that a part of the explanation I think is very helpful. So that's one thing, is just the bringing the national in to bringing the subnational in ways that helps you re-understand or understand in new ways how you should characterize the national. A second argument that the book makes is that subnational politics affect national politics. So you can't really understand what's going on in national politics unless you understand the subnational. And that has been a theme for a long time in the study of American politics because of the role of the South. So the role of the South, its racial politics and racial economy that was predicated on a racial caste system, the work of Rob Mickey and the work of Ira Katznelson show how that then, because of the South's pivotal role in Congress, affected all of American politics. It affected the limits on the American welfare state, the limits on racial justice in the United States. So that, I think, is a theme that has been well represented in the U.S. But, and this goes to also just I think just how rich this book is. You say another way to think about subnational institutions or subnational is not just formal units, but also informal units. And this goes to the thing Patrick said about rural and urban, and you talk about regional economies. And so I think the idea of looking at these informal units and maybe their relationship to formal divisions can be really illuminating. And here, I think a recent book by Jonathan Roden, which is very interesting, Why Cities Lose, he uses population density as his measure, so it is a kind of a rural-urban, but he shows how it intersects with majoritarian political systems to create things like Trump and other kinds of populist leaders in majoritarian political systems, how that informal then intersects with formal institutions to change politics. A third point that I want to make is that, and this is something that you explicitly say that you don't do, but I think there's a lot that could be done, and it's important in American politics. And maybe, and I'd be interested to hear what you say about it, maybe it's uniquely important in American politics, is to look at interest groups at the subnational level. And so students of American politics have long understood the importance of venue shopping. That if you can't get what you want at the local level, try going to the national level, try going to the state level. And there is a lot of rich literature on this. Groups pick the political arenas that are most open to them at any point in time. A book by Anthony Chen called The Fifth Freedom looks at civil rights activists and how they sought legislation against employment discrimination at the national level. When that failed, they went to the state level, and then how over a period of decades, what eventually started as employment equality turned into affirmative action, how working across levels of government changes policy over time. Eric Schickler's recent book on racial realignment makes a related argument about how civil rights groups use state politics to press forward, and in the process he challenges major explanations about racial realignment in the U.S. that only focused on the national level, the timing changes and the group strategy of understanding how racial realignment occurred, changes. Studies of American politics also feature arguments about group organization at the subnational level. And here I'm thinking of Skocpol's argument in Protecting Soldiers and Mothers that in a federated polity, having organizations that have capacity at the state level in multiple states has a huge difference for what kinds of capacities you can exercise at the national level. So she argues that there's a fit between subnational political organization and national institutions that can have a big impact on the influence that groups can have. And she's looking at that now in relationship to the Koch brothers funded group Americans for Prosperity. So I think that, this issue can be, is an important one to continue looking at. So I think that the subnational focus can be extended to a variety of issues relating to group organization and group strategy that would be particularly illuminating in understanding policy outcomes, and especially those that may occur over long periods of time as groups do this kind of venue shopping. And so the final issue I want to make, maybe I really don't have 50 minutes, is related to multi-level politics. And I think the strength of this book is talking about these relationships across levels of government, which seems to me to be crucial in understanding politics. It's crucial in the United States, and of course it's crucial in Europe, or the European Union, et cetera. But a question I would raise, and maybe this is kind of a forward-looking a question for research in the future, is what's the impact of technological change and mobilization from above on subnational politics? And the forward-looking piece of it is on the technology side. How do all these technologies that connect people much more freely and quickly, Twitter, Fox News, how much do they blur local distinctiveness and nationalize politics? And on the mobilization side, things like the Koch brothers, how does inequality, which puts huge resources concentrated in particular hands, how does that give people who have a lot of money the ability to influence politics all across the country? And people have written about, the nationalization of school board elections because of this kind of mobilization. Dan Hopkins has a very interesting book called The Increasingly United States, which argues that American political behavior is nationalized, at least in part because party and interest groups are funded nationally, so kind of becoming all the same thing, and that changes in media markets have become more national. So a question that could be raised here is doing this kind of analysis comparatively, and I would say that the U.S. Cross-level work is often, as a lot of American politics is, in political behavior. There could be more of a room for political behavior in the kind of cross-national work that you're talking about. But in comparatively, other countries, are they more nationalized in the United States, or could you look at some of these and ask the same question about whether forces of technology and forces of concentrated wealth are creating more nationalized political behavior in other countries as well? So I'll stop and say that this is an incredibly rich and stimulating book. I just kept writing down ideas for it as I read it, and so if there's anyone in the room who might be looking for research ideas, who might be wanting to get inspired about doing research, I totally recommend going to this book, and especially really focusing on the introduction, because it really provides a lot of insights, I think, that make you think about your own work differently and point out fruitful directions for future research. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. And it's a real pleasure to be able to participate on this panel. It was an incredible pleasure to participate in the first of the workshops when this volume was being created. It was in the spring of 2013 as I was transitioning to Brown, and I remember in this room seeing this exciting work and thinking it was really, really great. I just want to echo some of the points that were already raised. I think, reading through both the introduction of this volume, which is amazing, but also the individual chapters, you just learn a ton, not about just interesting methods, but also themes. But in the introduction, what I thought was so interesting is they talked about like different generations. There's a first generation, second generation. I couldn't quite understand where you were putting me. I hope in the latter, but it shows that there's an incredibly long tradition of this kind of subnational research in the field. And so what I want to do is actually make 3 points in my remarks. One is, how do we explain the periodic rediscovery of subnational research? So it's not like the first time. This is great, but we have a body of research that's happened before, and it's mentioned in the introduction. It exists or has existed in other fields. So what is it about this rediscovery of this level of analysis and comparisons at this level of analysis that every now and then gets rediscovered? And what can we learn about maybe our fields and the trajectory of our fields through that? The second is, I want to address the second point about how do we think about the relationship between different levels of analysis, and not just different subnational models and how they compare within countries, across countries, but how do we actually make sense of the national model and the subnational variation and the interface between those? And the third point I want to raise is, why does this matter? Why does this kind of research and the kind of analysis that's done at this level, why is that important for those of us who care about the fields of political science, sociology, other social sciences, but more importantly, the kinds of questions that we ask in these fields and why they're especially important today. So let me start with the first one, which is what's up with this kind of rediscovery of subnational variation and the cycles of that. So as the introduction of this volume suggests, there's a long tradition of subnational scholarship in comparative politics. And this was very important for me. Now, authors that you didn't mention in your introduction and are not in reference, but that were very important to me when I was in graduate school were people like Samuel Barnes. So Michigan electoral studies, who wrote this great book on representation in Italy. Suzanne Berger's work on Peasants Against Politics, which talks about aggregate, the formation, representation, and transformation of interests, of interest groups. Sid Taro's work on peasant communism in the Italian South. So peasants aren't just lumpen proletariat, bags of potato, but actually can mobilize in ways where you would least expect them. Or even Alan Zuckerman's early work on the prefects in Italy. All of this was work in the 60s. Mid-60s, late 60s, et cetera, and it all focused on the importance, whether you're talking about social movements, whether you're talking about interest representation, whether you're talking about electoral behavior or issues of governance. Big issues in our field. They were all talking about this at the subnational level at that period. But notwithstanding that in the 60s, as some of you said, ages ago they talked about subnationalism. In the 60s, there was another wave. Afterwards, notwithstanding that you had really important work focusing on this subnational level, the dominant paradigm was still the national model. The national, sort of the comparisons were across the nation state. So when I was in graduate school in the mid to late 1980s, that was very much the dominant paradigm in my subfield, comparative politics, but I would probably argue in political science as a whole. There was a bias towards this, and not like that people didn't pay attention to regional variation and that there was variation within countries, but the bias, the dominant way of studying this was at the nation state. Now maybe it was because of methodology, it was easier. You can collect data, or you could fly into the Capitol, or something like that. But I think that there are these sort of fashions in our discipline of paying attention to what's on the ground at a more subnational level, zooming up at a more macro level, and I think we should sort of explore what that's about. When I was in graduate school, it was the beginning of what was comparative capitalism, or what later on morphed into varieties of capitalism. That was kind of a dominant, if you did political economy, which I did, that was the dominant research program, and it still has a very long shadow today in our field. And this was predicated on certain assumptions, and the assumptions were that the key outcomes that we cared about at that time in comparative political economy, which were issues of labor rights and the relative power of labor versus capital, or the provision of welfare benefits and other social policy, training and education, financial intermediation, or actually the basic nature of capitalism across these different countries, that these were all determined primarily by national institutions and national policy. And so if those were the key questions, then you had to look up. You didn't look down at the subnational level. And I, at the time, was working on Italy, and I was struck by how those models didn't make sense. I was struck that there was an incredible amount of internal, domestic heterogeneity in patterns of political, economic, and social life, and that these national models didn't make sense for Italy. And it appeared to me at the time that there seemed to be as much variation within the country as there were across countries. But the closer that I looked at not just Italy, but other countries, Germany, the United States, Japan, India, Brazil, China, I saw that there were similar patterns of this kind of internal variation, even though the field was still stuck at the national level. And so what I argued then, and I continue to believe today, is that this sort of subnational variation, it's not random. And it's not accidental. It's not just like the legacy of incomplete state building. So you talked about maybe, others are more coherent than the United States. Well, and, like if you studied Italy, it was like, well, maybe it's because in Italy, they did state building was not as effective as how the French and Germans did it. And that was the real issue. But actually, the more you looked, you realize that regardless of, whether it was, Garibaldi or Bismarck or something, how effective they were, they actually had tremendous amount of subnational variations. And so that begged the question, what explains this? And this is where I think your volume is terrific, through the different chapters and even the methodological chapters that you have in the first section, because you really shed important light on this, is that it's not random, I think, and it's not just a legacy of particular patterns of historical development. I think underlying these subnational patterns are structures. What I saw were sociopolitical structures, networks that actually determined different patterns of political life, different patterns of economic organization and economic life, and even different patterns of civil society-state relations. And what I argued in the book that I wrote on Italy that was very much focused on the subnational variation was that the way to think about the relationship between the national level and the subnational level was that you had within countries, a lot of variation. It wasn't an infinite variation, it actually was structured, et cetera. You had to understand what the underlying structures are of that, like what Margaret just mentioned about the South versus the North, et cetera. But that where the nation state policy and institutions mattered was maybe shaping the distribution of those subnational models. Whether there were, different types and how were those distributed in countries, et cetera. And I have always been graphically challenged, but I had tried to, so I identified 3 models: polycentrism, hierarchy, and what was the third one? Polarized systems, and tried to show that there were very different distributions in the U.S., Italy versus Germany. If you actually tried to systematically look at these patterns and structure them, et cetera. And then the question was not to compare Italy versus Germany versus the U.S., but what would you gain if you studied polarized subnational models as opposed to polycentric across these different countries, not only within and across. And that was a way of maybe keeping that tension between the national and the subnational. I think what you all did here was very interesting as you talk about the spatial turn in political science, the availability of GIS and other kinds of technologies that allow us to actually see things in a way that we didn't see it at the granular level that we could. But I think that probably more could be done by playing with the comparisons vertically within countries, horizontally across countries at this level. So I think maybe if we did that, then we could sort of keep both levels of analysis always in sight and not go through these cycles like it's national, it's subnational, et cetera. Because I don't think it's about the questions we ask, and I'll return to that next. So that's the first thing. I think the important thing about the subnational work, which again this is really truly an excellent volume, is that it highlights a bunch of things. One is why this is important in terms of studying policy regime. So anytime, I think if you want to understand, environmental policy and its effectiveness, labor policy and its effectiveness, health policy and its effectiveness, as some of the chapters here do, security policy, as you mentioned here too, then studying this across subnational levels is important because it gives us a purchase, like why is it more effective here as opposed to there, and that might give us some insights into why that matters and why it's effective. But I guess I just want to conclude by just saying, why do I think it matters? And, I was preparing these remarks last night, and this was after I heard our colleague, Wendy Schiller, give a talk yesterday about some of the incredible research that she is doing with a former Brown student colleague around domestic violence and subnational variation in this country on laws to protect victims of domestic violence, and especially domestic violence linked to gun violence. And the way that Wendy framed her work and the way that she talked about it was really striking to me, because the way she talked about it was, it's not just like an interesting methodological turn, right? Oh, let's study subnational instead of national, and we can get cool new data, and it makes us closer to the field, or something like that. But actually, by studying this kind of variation within the nation state, it forces us to ask the big fundamental questions about that I think were originally motivated to come into this field with. And her question was about citizenship rights and the ability of individuals, regardless of their gender, to exercise their citizenship rights depends on whether or not there is variation within the country at the subnational level in the laws that protect victims of domestic violence. If you can't feel even safe in your own home, how can you exercise your citizenship rights, your economic rights, your social rights outside of the home? And this was, I was really struck by that framing. And so that's why I think this is so important, is that by studying issues at this level, it reminds us not that this is the latest fad, like, there's the experimentalist turn and therefore subnationalism, lends itself to that. There's the GIS turn and subnationalism lends itself to that. What subnationalism or subnational research reminds us of, especially when we keep the national model framework in the back of our mind, is it forces us to return to the key questions about political science, about what does it mean to be a citizen? How do we exercise citizenship rights? Why do some citizens, opposed to others, have access to public goods that aren't always so public? And those are the key questions that I think our colleagues in the 1960s and before were asking, and those are still the important questions today. So I want to thank you very much for producing this really terrific volume, because I think it reminds us why we do the work that we do. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much all for being here. It's Friday afternoon, so we really, really appreciate that. And thank you as well to Margaret, Rick, and Patrick for the very insightful and nice comments that you made to our book. I thought you were going to be meaner, a little bit meaner, or push us, but you didn't. It feels very nice to be back here where we started, right? 6 years ago, in this very same room. So Yeah, that was a flyer. And actually, what I wanted to focus on was some of the issues that were raised by the three speakers before us that talk a little bit about the future agenda of subnational research, some of the themes that we bring up in the conclusion to the volume, the importance of multi-level governance. So we really tried hard to put an emphasis on the interactions across levels of government. So subnational research is not only about subnational politics, but about how subnational politics shapes national level politics. This brings me back to the second point of scaling up. So Rich's original article on scaling down, which was the seminal piece that probably inspired most of us, or at least the newer generation of students, was all about scaling down. And I think that now, after 15, 20 years of very rich research, we really need to think more about how we scale up. And this goes back to the point that Margaret was making, which relates to how subnational politics helps us understand better how national politics work. And so in my own research on subnational democracy or subnational authoritarian regimes within democratic countries, that is basically what I'm trying to do. So I'm trying to push the national literature, the literature on national democracy, but making the point that in order to really understand how national democracy works, we really need to incorporate to our concepts of democracy and measures of democracy a territorial dimension. What we have now in studies of democracy is people who talk, or scholars who talk about national level processes, and then we have another big group of scholars who are focusing on subnational democracy. Those agendas, those literatures, they do not talk to each other. They pass each other. And so if we really want to understand how democracy works, if we really care about how democracy works, we really need to bring those two literatures together. And this is also true for other areas of study. So in an article with Jenny Pruitt, we also make the case that this is true for the welfare state, right? If we really want to understand how national welfare states work, we really need to incorporate how welfare is provided unevenly across the territory. So again, the idea of scaling up. Another point that was mentioned in the presentation before us, and that I think that we did not reflect on it while we were working on this volume, is the interaction or the linkages between the informal units and the formal units. And that's key. So we talked and discussed extensively about how at the end of the day, we are constrained by the availability of data. The data that is produced at the subnational level is typically attached to formal jurisdictions. So most of the electoral data, socioeconomic indicators pertain to formal subnational jurisdictions. But many of the processes that we care about take place in what we call informal jurisdictions. So we're constrained by the data we have if we want to use it quantitatively for the most part, because that data pertains to a subnational formal unit, but we care about informal units and how processes develop within them. But we have not talked about how informal and formal units interact as well. And I think that that is a very promising line of research. Very challenging. I mean, I cannot imagine how you would do research combining both, but I think that that's something to pay attention to. And the final point I wanted to make was in light of the very insightful comment that Rick made about the cycles of rediscovery. Actually, I had never thought about that before until you brought it up. And I think that it's true. It's like we are rediscovering subnational politics over and over again. And I think that the answer you provided is quite spot on. I think that we really need more cross-national, subnational comparisons in order to raise the pedigree of subnational politics. If we were able to combine, I mean, most of the work that we have on subnational politics is within country. We rarely compare countries and subnational units across countries. I think if we were to do that type of work more in line of the work you did a couple of years ago, we would be raising the pedigree of subnational research as well, and hopefully we would avoid these cycles of rediscovery. So I think I'm going to end.
Right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. It's a real pleasure to be back at Brown, and indeed back where this all started, not just this book, but where my career essentially started as well. So it's a bit surreal, but very nice at the same time. Thanks to the discussants for really excellent comments as well, and very thought-provoking. I just want to raise sort of 3 points, or kind of engage with 3 points. And maybe I'll start actually with the last one that Agustina mentioned about, in response to Rick's great point about the rediscovery of the subnational. I think indeed, I agree with Agustina that part of this is about thinking more deeply about the work, and with Rick's point as well, about the works that are existing and that came before before the first generation. I'm not sure what the term would be for those. But it's also kind of building on to Margaret's point, thinking about sort of talking to each other across subfields. So in a way, I also read this book and the effort that went into it as a sort of point of dialogue with other subfields and other disciplines as well, to go to Patrick's point in terms of sociology and anthropology, which I'll come back to as well. But if we think about sort of interesting work that's happening right now on urban politics, for example, one of the big pushes is to engage in more comparative urban political analysis, and to do so both across the global north and the global south, right? To bring those into dialogue instead of sort of siloing to one or the other. So I think that provides an excellent example of how sort of a subnational lens, sort of writ large, can push us to not only rediscover what came before, but rediscover or discover what our colleagues are doing across the aisle, so to speak. So in a way, I would sort of urge us to think about this book, or at least the way that I think about it, as a channel for dialoguing with other subfields and other disciplines where the subnational has indeed been sort of central to the analyses. A second point is about Patrick was on my dissertation committee, and while he never asked me why I wasn't studying sewers, he did always ask me really provocative, sort of big questions. And so I really liked your point about, why aren't we studying sewers? At least in political science, why aren't we studying sewers? Certainly anthropologists have been doing that as of late. And when I think about sort of, why study sewers, or why study garbage pickup, or why study electricity lines, or why study cops walking the beat on the streets, in part, I think what this work tries to do is to highlight that these are inherently political objects and interests and processes, and that these are embedded with sort of power relations between citizens and the state, between citizens and bureaucrats, between criminals and politicians as well. So in a way, if you get the book, there's a neat table that I really like, Figure 1.1, Varieties of Territorial Units, where we just kind of try to think about, creatively, what are the different types of units that we can think about at the national and at the subnational, right? Everything from census tracts to dioceses to legal parcels of property, but also extra-legal parcels of property, ecological zones, territories controlled by gangs, paramilitaries. I think it kind of pushes us, and going back to the formal, informal, to really sort of widen our lens on what a level of analysis is, but also what the units of analysis are, and what those units of analysis sort of bundle together in terms of politics and relationships between actors with different sort of levels of power. And that connects to my sort of last point about why this matters. I'm very interested in Wendy's work that Rick mentioned here on domestic abuse in the United States and sort of variation in laws. And indeed, I would agree that these types of focal points at the sort of, what I would call sort of micro level, tell us a lot about the substance of citizens' rights, As Rick was saying, if you can't feel safe at home, how do you engage the state then, or how do you feel safe engaging the state? And I think there's a lot of work that's emerging that takes a subnational approach that tackles that very question. I'm thinking here of Vesla Weaver's work on sort of policing in the United States and how the experience of being stopped in your own community and frisked by the police officer has a ton of different consequences for how you think about yourself as a citizen, for your relationship to the state, for your relationship to the police, for your relationship to welfare agencies, that sort of cascade. Or Sandra Lay's work at CIDE in Mexico that looks at how victimization has a broad level of downstream consequences for how you engage the state or don't engage the state after you feel that it hasn't lived up to its theoretical responsibility to uphold order and uphold your rights. So I guess with that, I would just say that, for me, part of the fun of this project was, well, there was a lot of fun parts, but part of the fun of this project was sort of getting into that creative thinking about how the spaces we look at and think about as political can go beyond the national, certainly, but certainly also beyond the subnational in terms of a territorial unit, but also relationships at the subnational that are rooted in those territories.
So yeah, this is a homecoming for Eduardo, as he just mentioned, in some ways, and for this book. So it started here. I brought the original poster back in 2013, and Rick, as he mentioned, wasn't a newbie here at Brown. He had just arrived. We had no idea we'd be sitting here 6 years later with a book. Maybe we hoped we would be. Yeah, but you never know, and didn't know what it would look like if it worked and who would publish it and all of that stuff. So it feels good. It's a sense of completion. So at one point along the way, somewhere in midlife crisis mode, I spent time at a Zen center, and the Zen master said, mouth open, already in trouble. Mouth open, already in trouble, meaning like, don't say much. Be quiet. So I'm tempted to not say very much, but I'm not a Zen master. I'm a professor. So, I'm already in trouble. Just a couple of quick thoughts. Eduardo preempted me on Patrick. Patrick said that this is an invitation. The subnational analysis is an invitation to field work. It's also an invitation to interdisciplinarity. And not surprisingly, fieldwork and interdisciplinarity are hallmarks of how we have done graduate training in the social sciences, at least the Watson-connected piece of the social sciences at Brown and the graduate program in development, which you were part of, the GPD at some point, and other students are. And Margaret, I think it's a fascinating question. I don't know the answer to it. About whether, technological change and the new connectedness and potential homogenization of information allowed by, Twitter and whatever, whether, nothing is local anymore. And I don't think so. And I'll get back to that in a second. Well, actually, I'll get to it now, and it's somewhat related to Rick's point about, if the only value of this sort of exercise is to trumpet a new faddish turn, then, in the face of a million turns, everyone's turning, then it's like that bird song, turn, 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 or Dylan song, I guess. And we're just going in circles. So that's not too good. But we do a lot of that in life. But what I think is a value beyond turns is having flexibility with regard to scale and being aware that don't assume homogeneity across space. And especially don't assume homogeneity across space in highly unequal places. And, I think the Gini index is going to be kind of troubling in this country for at least a while to come, and in many countries, certainly in Latin America. And when you have inequality, you're pretty likely to have some humanly meaningful and significant and tangible, touchable, subnational variance. In other words, local politics should still matter, even in the face of technological innovation. That's just a hunch. My own trajectory started with scaling down. Well, yeah, it's been scaling down. And at this point, You know, I don't know if I'll ever scale back up again. You know, I began, before I went to graduate school, doing cross-national, small-end, cross-national research of countries, 4 countries that I have never set foot in until a couple months ago. I finally made it to Paraguay. One of the countries, Zaire, doesn't exist anymore. It's now the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've never been to the Philippines, and I've never been to Haiti, although I'd love to go. And then in grad school, ended up doing a small-end subnational comparative analysis of 4 coffee-producing states in Mexico, 1 sector. I was going to do like 4 sectors. There's going to be coffee and apples and furniture and toys and corn and who knows what. And then all of a sudden it occurred to me, Peter Evans was right. He said, you know, maybe you should just do 1 sector. Sectors are more complicated than you think to get a handle on. So I'm like, okay, thanks, Peter. I'll just do coffee. But I got to have variation because I'm a comparativist. So what am I going to do? Coffee producing states in southern Mexico. So instead of, you know, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Haiti, it was Oaxaca, Puebla, Guerrero, y Chiapas. And nowadays, I just want to study where I live, the city I live in. And since it's Providence, you know, neighborhood, cross neighborhood, even within neighborhood variance. And guess what? There's plenty of inequality in this city, and there's plenty of variance over small distances. So local inequality, which is inequality that can often be quite sharp across small spatial distances, is, I think, very exciting, and I don't think Twitter is going to take it away anytime soon. So thanks to everybody for coming to this, for participating in this, and I'll turn it back over to, unless you guys want to add some things, I'll turn it over to our chair, to Patsy Lewis.
It's all political scientists, and it's not just all political science, it's all comparative politics. And so, and maybe all the contributors are comparative politics. So I guess my question is, where's the room for subnational, international politics? And have you thought about that, and is that even mentioned in the book? Certainly none of the presentations mentioned international, or cross-border, or transnational. But I can just, off the top of my head, think about, you know, even in my own work, I wrote a book about the siege of Sarajevo, so a city. Why is it the longest siege in world history? Well, because of international context. And subnational, other sieges within Bosnia having different outcomes because of international connections. Or even, Eduardo, in your own work on Colombia, you can't explain why Medellin blows up in the 80s without understanding U.S. pressure to extradite certain traffickers, right? That international context matters. Or Rich says he wants to study, you know, Providence now. We can't understand Providence without immigration, right? So this is an international issue. So where's there room in comparative politics, I guess, and then also in IR? I mean, I honestly can't think on one hand the number of international relations scholars who do subnational analysis. Maybe they do it, but they don't talk about it that way.
Can we take a few questions and then turn it over?
Agustina, you mentioned challenges getting data at the local level because it's collected and formalized and kept by government or formal institutions at the local level. But then you said, but then that may not even be the kind of data that we would want to get because the kind of data we want is sort of observational and informal network analysis. So what kinds of data in this world of data now would you, if you could get, what would you want to be able to present? What would you want to be able to collect at that level that would be of the type of this informal sort of cross-county or cross-geographic space boundaries that would tell us something about either citizenship or inequality or citizen activism? What would you look for?
Another question before we turn it over. Okay, you can go ahead.
Sure. So thanks for the question, Peter. I think it's a very provocative one. I think it's one ripe for another edited volume as well. But no, I think more seriously, certainly, I think comparativists. So I'll speak from my own experience in terms of comparativists working on crime are certainly thinking about the international in terms of international flows of drugs, international flows of arms, and how those have implications for violence and crime and political criminal relations at the subnational level. But it sounds like, from your comment, that you're highlighting perhaps that within IR that hasn't been happening as much. So, I mean, one sort of obvious move forward is for more dialogue between sort of people that are working at the intersection of crime between IR and CP and security studies, which is starting to happen, right? There's certainly initiatives like the Social Science Research Council, Drug Security and Democracy that I was a part of, you were a part of, Rich was a part of, and others from here, Angelica Martinez and others were a part of, where people I think are starting to put the international and the subnational into dialogue. But I think I would say as well that it hasn't been done systematically, right, to kind of think through what are the nature of the relationships between these, when do they matter, when do they don't matter, when can we think of them separately versus interactively. I think that's ripe for more research.
Can I jump on that? So at American University, we created a research cluster that's called Complex Governance. And I'm at the School of International Service, where many IR people are, and the comparativists, we're a minority. And the idea of this research is to bringing together IR scholars with scholars who do subnational research, specifically in two themes: environmental politics. I mean, how global governance regarding environment affects local communities. Everything is local when it comes to the environment, and public health, another big thing. And we have a substantively big group of scholars who do work on civil war and how international organizations are shaping peacekeeping, actually. It's not civil wars. And we're starting to bridge the gap. I think that comparativists are more open at incorporating the international context than IR people. That's my take on that. I think that in our volume we draw most of our idea of multi-level governance and interaction across levels of governments from IR theory, right? So IR scholars have been talking about how international factors or context affect national level politics, and we are doing sort of the same, but going one level of government below. So I think that comparativists are very open to that type of research. I'm more skeptical about IR people, but I'm sure that there are IR people here that can make comments about that. I have not taken a course on IR in ages, so I don't know how it's taught these days. Is there any discussion about subnational politics in IR courses? Or?
Yeah, I guess on Peter's question, one thing we're careful about, I think, at least tried to be, because a lot of the pushback we got was, there are a lot of things that aren't subnational, and you shouldn't, certain policy issues are best studied, perhaps, at the national level. I mean, if it's nuclear proliferation and treaties, international treaties, and so forth. I would mention that in democratic systems, and Wendy has some work, your first book on trade policy, if I'm remembering correctly, or maybe an article about that we cite. You might think trade policy is best studied at the national level. That's fine, except that where you have a legislature, an assembly that is part of the policymaking process, those representatives are responding to local constituents. So there's even a subnational dimension. All politics is local, right? But I remember getting a a clipping from our sociology colleague, who unfortunately isn't around. I mean, he's here, but not here, Dietrich Reuschenmeier. And, he knew we were doing this, and Dietrich sent me a newspaper article about how California, after President Trump's election, decided that California might try to pursue, and they're being sued now, right, the government of California, its own sort of climate change policy against the grain of national federal policy under President Trump. So we'll see how that plays out. I wanted to jump back onto the issue that Patrick raised about studying source, since you picked it up. Why don't more people study it? Well, I wouldn't recommend it. It's certainly for first books. I mean, you could have a great title, but just think about the reviews you would be setting yourself up for. Review articles. Yeah, I mean, to put it seriously, it's an important public good.
The type of data that I would like to get, I think that the data exists. Geographers have that type of data. They have a different way of, they are not bounded by formal or informal jurisdictions. They collect data at a much smaller scale, and they have that data. We political scientists have not been trained to produce that data. We are consumers of data that is produced by governments for formal jurisdictions, right? So you have information about how people vote. You have information about elections. You have information about socioeconomic indicators, and all of those pieces of data pertain to a formal jurisdictional unit, a municipality, a province, a department, you name it. I would like to have more granular data that allows me to compare a bunch of municipalities that, in my research design, for instance, are my informal unit of analysis. So if you're studying cartels in Mexico and you're studying the Sinaloa cartel, that cartel comprises a bunch of states, right? And so I would not like to be bounded by the formal data that exists for each individual state. I would like to have political data or socioeconomic data that informs or speaks to that informal unit. That data can be created. I mean, geographers create that data because they process data differently. We as political scientists, we have to take an extra step to produce that data. We have to learn it first and then to produce it. And that poses some challenges, some challenges for the type of research we do. So ideally, I think I would like to work with a geographer, maybe. That's what I would like to do. And this speaks also to the multidisciplinary type of work that I think we need to engage and do more.
Tony?
Yeah, I look forward to reading. I don't really know what's in it and what's not in it. And I guess I want to speak a little bit to the question of the relationship between the levels, why it's important, and in some sense, to Wendy's point, Rick's point about the importance of citizenship. And I think one of the things that's happened over the last 100 years, 50 years in particular, is that the effective rights of citizenship are more and more dependent on the provision of local services. Right? I mean, so more than before, to be a citizen depends on how good your schools are, how good your health is, how good your sewer systems are, and so on. At the same time, over at least the last 30 years, what we've seen is almost everywhere a shift in the share of tax revenue at the subnational level going upwards. So we have a tension between the centralization of finance, at least at the national level, and the delivery of the public services that define citizenship at the local level. And that, I mean, this is particularly brutal in America, right? Because we don't redistribute across jurisdictions, or at least across states. But it's everywhere true. And I'm just wondering, in the book, or do you discuss the these kinds of, the importance of these fiscal flows for linking the struggles for citizenship and services at the subnational level with the state structures that determine how finance flows from the top, increasingly from the top back down.
That's not clear to me, and it's the one or handful of key theoretical takeaways from this agenda, because I can see the methodological point right away, right? There's variation at like the subnational or local level that is important, that we should care about, that we should study, and also kind of leveraging variation across places for comparative purposes. But what is, like in all the examples that were mentioned today, subnational politics was used both as an exponence, an exponandum, and like at the end of the day, is this just saying local politics matters, or is there something kind of more substantive to this? So this is just like a provocation maybe, but something that I'd like to understand better myself, because this is something that I'm told. I study variation in housing, public housing, and infrastructure provision. So I actually do study sewers, Patrick, in Mexico, and at the local level, right? And I'm saying party organization varies across neighborhoods. So again, like very micro variation. But then political scientists, when I try to present my work, will always ask, okay, so party organization varies and infrastructure provision varies. Why should I care about that? Beyond the fact that it's substantively important, right? What's the theoretical takeaway from this? Is it just an empirical observation?
Any more questions?
Who wants to take it? Rather than me? I'd say I wanted to, but I will. No. Let me speak mainly to MA's very good question about what's the theoretical message or what's the theoretical payoff. And, you know, this is, I mean, we don't have a clear, focused theoretical agenda. I think the best way to tackle that question is to look at particular research areas and see how literature evolves, in other words, how knowledge is produced and accumulated. And one argument would be, if you look, and we make this, you know, we review a couple of different literatures, the democratization literature and violence and civil war, social policy, and, you know, the claim is, what if you do the counterfactual and imagine that those literatures were stuck at one level of analysis, not allowed to go to different scales? Would we know more or less about these important questions? And I think our answer is we know a lot less. And, you know, theory can advance because theoretical propositions developed at one scale might be tested at another scale. New ideas can develop if you sneak down to a different scale or move up to a different scale. Having said that, we are, you know, we have a caution here, which is we warn against what we call theory stretching. Pardon to Giovanni Sartori and conceptual stretching. So we stretched his notion of conceptual stretching, sorry, Giovanni, and stretched it to theory. And so you have theory stretching. And, you know, that would be typically the way it appears in the literature, as far as I think we agreed on this, was that typically, unreflectively, theories were generated for national level cases and sort of tested or stretched to other scales, and maybe that's not a good idea. So being a little more conscious, not just about, there's a lot of talk about how good theory is bounded through scope conditions, at least in the social sciences. I don't know about in physics. But in the social sciences, you know, well, do you mean this is a universal theory that's true, you're claiming is true for all times and all places? I don't think those things exist in the social sciences, just given the nature of human beings as the most complex actor in the universe, as far as we know. So it's good to have scope conditions. You know, Theda Skocpol, I have a theory of social revolutions, but it's for a particular kind of, you know, neo-patrimonial or patrimonial agrarian bureaucracy. Not all places and all times. So by analogy, I think it's good to have scope conditions that specify scale and level. So is this a national level theory? Is this a state, provincial level theory? Is it a neighborhood level theory? So those are some of the implications for theory of this book.
Yeah, and to second that, so take the case of the literature on democracy or democratization. What we have found by studying democracy at the subnational level is that many of the well-established theories, modernization theory, for instance, they don't travel well to subnational levels of government, right? So more development does not correlate with more democracy at the subnational level. And that's a very strong theoretical implication, at least within the subfield of political regime and democracy. So it's not just the variation, but rather that we find that things work differently. And that theories that were very well established in political science, in the study of democracy, do not explain why democracy doesn't work at the subnational level, right? So we really need to come up with new theories.
Yeah, but that speaks to Richard's previous point about scope conditions for scale and level, right? So is it that you falsify the theory by looking at it subnationally, or is it that the theory was never meant to be applied subnationally and it only kind of, not that I'm trying to
It was
defend
never meant to
theory,
be.
Or it was never, I think part of it is, part of the, what we say in chapter 1 is that authors and scholars should be cognizant of the issue of levels of analysis and be more explicit about whether their theories work at one level, multiple levels, and sort of highlight that as a way to allow us to either test them at different levels, or and to sort of build conversations between scholars that way as well.
And on Tony, they don't talk about fiscal.
No, we
flows.
don't, no. Thank you.
And the relations between the levels? I mean, is there an attempt to?
Not from financial, but that would have actually been a great addition to this volume.
There's a question.
Yeah, this has all been really interesting. To echo, I obviously haven't read the book yet, so this might just be impressions relative to what you're trying to communicate. But from a consistent theme across the sort of data issues as well as the sort of like tax structural issues, part of the way I'm hearing your message is that an overt focus on political science has come at the expense of nuanced methodologies for social science. That the lacuna of subnational comparisons is in part driven by the way in which we frame our questions and what choices we tend to focus on. And I was wondering if you had commentary on what could be done at like the university or institutional level to encourage these types of methodologies get their due attention.
It's on our book. I think required reading for all first-year social science students.
I'm a little unclear what you mean by this. I'm not sure you were setting, Patrick sort of set that up more than anybody else, I think. Rather than, right, in your remarks you set up that frame, but I'm not sure this book sets up that frame. Really? Is that what you're saying? That
Well, that's what I mean. Like, I haven't read the book, but it sounds like there's a consistency between, well, we have certain types of data and they're dictated by national organizations. And in the profession, there are certain policy issue spaces that are more prominent than others, and they tend to be at the national level, and that's the focus of major political decision making. So, I mean, professionally speaking, having the overt dedication to political science as opposed to just social science, there's less of a bias towards what the particular margins of comparison and what the particular scope of selection are if you're just asking questions about human communities and human choices as opposed to public policy relevance or specific questions of citizenship.
I think there's a different way of looking at it, though, and thinking about the ways in which we've operated in silos. Getting back to the sewer question, I was thinking about in the study of U.S. politics, right? There has been work by Jessica Traunstein on sewers, but it's framed in terms of the study of racial and ethnic politics in the United States. And we have done studies of trash collection. Here I'm thinking of Patricia Strzok's excellent work on 19th century trash collection in the US, but there to the lens of gender, right? So we study racial and ethnic politics in the US, we study gender politics in the US, and they have strong subnational emphases to them. But we don't see that as this systematic study of subnational politics, for instance. We think about racial and ethnic politics, gender politics. So in some senses, the work is being done, but we're just not connecting the different ways in which we look at subnational. So we do rediscover it systematically, but I think it's also being done, but through these different kinds of buckets.
Yeah.
But I think Dan's point is a really good point, which is that, you know, what's the interface between questions we ask, the data availability, and how we ask them. And so if you think about the Robert Putnam book, which you guys reference here, you know, the first step, before he gets into the last couple chapters where he speculates about what social capital is, but before, the book is really about a study of the effect of these new institutions, right, provincial level governments, and does that actually change partisanship behaviors? They didn't exist until after 1970. And so you know, so you wouldn't have any data before then. Then after 1970, you start collecting it, and that's when they collected it to say, actually, the existence of even though they operate differently in different regions, which got them into the South versus the North, but before was, it actually brought together people from different partisan parties together. That was point number one of that book. So I think what would be interesting, and this is, I think, in the spirit of your work, is how do we promote more of this interdisciplinarity so that we're not blindsided by, well, actually, they have data that could be useful to us to ask these questions, and we're not only asking questions that are limited by the data availability or the concepts that we have. But at the institutional level, nothing will be done. It has to be done by bottom-up research.
How important do you think it is to the field of subnational politics to have a cross-country comparative frame? I'm thinking that if, given the challenges in collecting the kind of data, and one would assume that it takes longer, maybe not, or it's a more complex process to understand a space that doesn't have a lot of data. How feasible it is how important is it, do you think, to have that kind of perspective across countries for comparative purposes, so that you don't get caught in the kind of problems that Rich had, where he wanted to compare places he had never set foot in?
It's very important. How viable it is. I mean, if you're a PhD student, you have a lot of time to do field work. As a more senior scholar, it becomes harder unless you get a chunk of time to do field work. But I encourage my PhD students to do cross-national, subnational comparisons. I mean, we all have done that, right, in our respective work. We have gone to multiple countries and studied different subnational units.
Well, how do you get away from being just a dilettante, just flitting and? Because to understand places.
Well, I knew one of the cases, I knew it very well. I am from Argentina, so I did not have to do a lot of research on that. But maybe you can speak, I mean,
I think there's, I appreciate the point about sort of, avoiding swooping into somewhere in the capital city, grabbing some data from the government archives and then swooping out and then claiming you know the case. I think there's a push, particularly within folks who are doing comparative ethnographic work, for example, in political science. So I'm thinking about a recent article by Nicholas Rush-Smith and Erica Simmons at Wisconsin-Madison, where they argue that and outline a series of techniques that people are using to engage in comparative ethnography, right, which requires sort of embedding yourself in a place, building trust with communities or your interlocutors, and doing that across countries as well. And part of their argument is that kind of work requires money, right? It requires resources. Perhaps it requires working not as an individual scholar, but in collaboration with other scholars who have a higher degree of familiarity with those contexts to bring those perspectives together. And I think a third point they raise is working with sort of local academics as well and bringing them in as part of teams as well to do research, which of course, by the way you just looked at me, also raises a whole host of ethical, yes, absolutely, it raises a whole host of ethical issues and power issues as well.
Or maybe you can invite them to bring you into the conversation.
Yes.
Any more questions? Comments? Okay, the books and the food await. So thank you all very much for coming and for a rich discussion.